In this video, I want to continue our talk of the pentose phosphate pathway and talk a little bit more about the non-oxidative phase, because in the previous video we kind of focused a little bit more on the oxidative phase. We said in the last video that the pentose phosphate pathway produced two things. Those two things were NADPH and ribulose 5-phosphate. And we said that the NADPH provided reducing power for biosynthesis, for anabolic pathways, and then ribulose 5-phosphate was used as a precursor to different nucleic acid synthesis. Okay. Now, ribulose 5-phosphate, I've drawn it here, is in the last video I referred to it as R5P. In this video and henceforth I will refer to it as RU5P. And the reason why is because ribulose 5-phosphate can be turned into this other molecule here called ribose 5-phosphate, and that's something we mentioned in the previous video, or at least we hinted at it. We said that ribulose sounds a lot like ribose. So ribulose can be turned into ribose 5-phosphate, and now ribose 5-phosphate is something I will actually refer to as R5P henceforth. The enzyme that catalyzes this reaction is called phosphopentose isomerase. Phosphopentose isomerase, and that name makes sense. Both of these compounds are pentoses. They are 5-carbon sugars that have phosphate groups, so phosphopentose makes sense. And isomerase makes sense because they're only slightly different. Ribulose 5-phosphate is a ketose, right? It has this carbonyl here in between two carbons, whereas ribose 5-phosphate is an aldose. It has its carbonyl up here as an aldehyde. Okay. Now this ribose 5-phosphate is of course a precursor to many biomolecules, including some nucleic acids. Okay, so now further, things we should already know from the previous video is that pentose phosphate pathway, the pentose phosphate pathway, diverts off of glycolysis at G6P, glucose 6-phosphate. So once glucose 6-phosphate is created, it can either continue in glycolysis or go to the pentose phosphate pathway. Another thing that we should already know is that the oxidative phase of the pentose phosphate pathway makes NADPH and ribulose 5-phosphate, which of course can be turned into ribose 5-phosphate from that reaction we've just seen there. Okay. Now, when we talk about the non-oxidative phase, we'll talk about it in more details in just a second, but we should be familiar, at least to a certain extent, with these terms here. So I'm going to be referring to things mostly by these abbreviations here. These are all a bunch of monosaccharides. So RU5P and R5P, ribulose 5-phosphate and ribose 5-phosphate, are both 5-carbon molecules that we've already encountered. But the rest of these things here, X5P, xylulose 5-phosphate, G3P, glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, S7P, acetoheptulose 7-phosphate, E4P, erythrose 4-phosphate, and F6P, fructose 6-phosphate. I'm not actually going to be drawing all of these different things, so I'm just going to be referring to them by their abbreviations. But what's most important is that you recognize how many carbons each one of these molecules is, and that'll help you understand the pathway. So X5P is a 5-carbon molecule, and actually the numbers here actually refer to how many carbons there are. No, they don't refer to it. The number indicates where the phosphate is, but the phosphates are all on the ends of these carbon chains. So glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate is a 3-carbon molecule. Acetoheptulose, 7 carbons. Erythrose 4-phosphate, 4 carbons. Fructose 6-phosphate, 6 carbons. We've actually seen glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate and fructose 6-phosphate before in glycolysis. Okay, let's move on to the actual non-oxidative phase now. If you recall, we talked about it, or we mentioned it in the previous video as being just a series of carbon shuffling reactions, or moving carbons around. So what is the overall process, though? In the overall process, we're taking 3 ribulose 5-phosphates and turning them into 2 F6Ps and 1 G3P. Let's see if that makes sense. If we have 3 5-carbon molecules here, that's a total of 15 carbons that we're starting off with. So how many carbons do we have over here? Well, F6P we said was a 6-carbon molecule. G3P was a 3-carbon molecule. So the total number of carbons that we have here is 12 carbons, and here 3 carbons, for a total, of course, of 15 carbons. We go from 15 carbons to 15 carbons, so everything's cool there. So something that you should bear in mind about this process, if we're starting off with 3 ribulose 5-phosphates and turning them into 2 F6Ps and 1 G3P, it's important to recognize that all of these reactions are reversible. Okay, that's very, very important. I'll get to why later. So let's say we start off with 3 ribulose 5-phosphates, okay, like we set up here in the overall process. So we said that Ru5P can be turned into R5P, right, another 5-carbon molecule. It can also be turned into X5P, so xylulose 5-phosphate. Now, if we have 3 ribulose 5-phosphates, and we're going to turn them into R5P and X5P, we're going to have two of one of these and one of the other. We're actually going to make 1 ribulose 5-phosphate, or ribose 5-phosphate, excuse me, R5P, and 2 X5Ps. This top reaction here we just mentioned earlier is that phosphopentose isomerase catalyzes that reaction to go from Ru5P to X5P. It's a different enzyme called phosphopentose epimerase, and epimers are actually just diastereomers that differ in chirality at only one chiral center. I encourage you to go back and look through the structures of all these different compounds, but I did not draw them in this video just for simplicity's sake. And before we can actually talk about the steps and the reactions of the non-oxidative phase, we have to understand this simple detail here. There are enzymes called transketolases, and there are enzymes called transaldolases. The transketolases catalyze reactions that transfer 2 carbons, and transaldolases transfer 3 carbons in the reactions. Okay, so let's get into the actual steps for the reactions of this pathway. First step is we're going to take 1 X5P and 1 R5P, which are each both 5-carbon molecules, and we're going to turn them into 1 G3P and 1 S7P, okay, which is 1 3-carbon molecule and 1 7-carbon molecule. Now, specifically, we're going to take this 1 X5P and turn it into this G3P. So we're going from a 5-carbon molecule to a 3-carbon molecule, and then we're going to take this R5P and turn it into this S7P. So what happened? Basically, well, actually, let's think about this. Which enzyme catalyzed this step, a transaldolase or a transketolase? Well, if we went from X5P to G3P, that means we lost 2 carbons there, right? Well, what happened to those 2 carbons? R5P went from 5 carbons to 7 carbons, so it must have gained those 2 carbons. So we had a 2-carbon transfer here. That means we had a 2-carbon donor and a 2-carbon acceptor. The donor is the X5P because it lost those 2 carbons, and R5P is the acceptor because it gained those 2 carbons. Since it was a 2-carbon transfer, that means we had a transketolase catalyzing this reaction. Cool. That's pretty much it for the first step. So how many Ru5P equivalents have we used so far? Well, we have 1 X5P and 1 R5P, so that's 2 of them. Both of those are 5-carbon equivalents that came from Ru5P. So we had 1 X5P and 1 R5P used. In the second step, we're going to take this G3P and S7P that we made, and we're going to turn them into F6P and E4P. Specifically, this G3P will be turned into F6P, and this S7P will be turned into E4P. So how many carbons were transferred? Well, if we went from a 3-carbon molecule to a 6-carbon molecule, it means we gained 3 carbons there, and then those 3 carbons must have been lost by the S7P. So we had a 3-carbon transfer, so we have a 3-carbon donor and a 3-carbon acceptor. The 3-carbon acceptor is the G3P because it gained 3 carbons to become an F6P. So we have the acceptor was G3P. S7P was the donor because it lost those 3 carbons, so S7P here. And if this was a 3-carbon transfer, then it must have been a transaldolase that catalyzed this reaction. That's it for the second reaction, or the second step. So far, how many Ru5P equivalents have we used? Well, still just 2, right? We had the 1 X5P and the 1 R5P that we used up in the first step, And those things were turned into the G3P and S7P, so we haven't used that third equivalent yet. In this third step, third reaction, we're taking an X5P and an E4P that we just created. So we took this E4P here that we just created, and we're adding an X5P. So this X5P is going to be turned into this G3P. So here we're going from here to here, and then this E4P will be turned into this F6P. So this thing gained 2 carbons, right, going from 4 to 6. And this thing lost 2 carbons. So we had a 2 carbon transfer. That means we had a 2 carbon donor and an acceptor. The donor was X5P because it lost the carbons. E4P gained them, so it was the acceptor. And this, of course, then, because of the 2 carbon transfer, was catalyzed by a transketolase. At this point, how many RU5P equivalents have we used so far? Well, now we've used all 3, right? We had the initial one, we had that one X5P and the one R5P from the first step, and now we just use this one X5P here. So we've used all of them. Okay, so now we said before that the overall reaction was going to take 3 RU5Ps and turn them into 2 F6Ps and 1 G3P. How did that actually happen? Well, we should be able to go back and look at these 3 steps and think to ourselves, okay, what did we create and what did we use up? Okay, so here in that first step at the top, we took an X5P and turned it into a G3P, X5P and an R5P, turned it into a G3P and an S7P. That one G3P and S7P were both used up. So we can go ahead and cross this here. Anything that's on both the left and right side, right, we can cross that off because it's created and then it's used up. Created and used up. So those shouldn't be in the overall reaction. And same thing with this E4P here. Had it, we created it, and then we used it up. So what do we have left over? Okay, on the left side of the reaction, we have one X5P and one R5P here. That's 2 RU5P equivalents, and here's the third one here. So on the left side, we have the 3 RU5Ps, and on the right side, nothing there. We have one F6P here, one F6P here, and one G3P here. So that is 2 F6Ps and 1 G3Ps. So we basically took 3 ribulose 5-phosphates and turned them into 2 F6Ps and 1 G3P. What do we notice about these 2 compounds? They are actually glycolytic intermediates. So they're from glycolysis. So if we have a lot of RU5P and if it's an excess, then that means we'll create a lot of F6P and G3P, and those things can go to glycolysis. So if there's an excess, glycolysis can happen. Okay, but this is kind of weird. Wait a minute. I thought we said in the previous video that the non-oxidative phase makes R5P when NADPH is not needed. What happened? Why did we create F6P and G3P? That doesn't make any sense. Remember, the reactions are reversible. That's what's important here. So basically, if we have F6P and G3P, we can go backwards and create a bunch of RU5P and R5P, and we can make a bunch of this. Okay, so we can go the other way. Okay, so we go backwards and make R5P without making NADPH. Because if you go back and look at all the steps that we just talked about, none of them mentioned NADPH. So there's no NADPH or NADP plus at all. So if we run this reaction backwards, we can create R5P without making NADPH. Hope that video was helpful.